The next set of directives are directives that allow us to deal with some funny parts of the HTML spec. In the HTML spec, attributes like disabled don't actually take a value, but instead, the presence of the disabled attribute indicates that the element itself is to be disabled, and the value of the attribute really has no bearing. But certain browsers, like Chrome and Firefox, allow you to set a value, where other browsers like IE don't. So Angular gave us some attributes to deal with that. Those attributes are the ng disabled, ng checked, ng multiple, ng read only, and ng selected. These directives will either add or remove their respective attributes when you set them to a true or false value. So let's look at an example of this. We'll just go over the disabled directive, but the other directives work exactly the same. Let's run into here, and before these divs, let's create a button. Now we can see that button here in the browser, and you can see it's enabled. I can click it. Go back over here to our HTML, and let's add the disabled directive. We'll set it equal to a value of button disabled. Now I go to my scope, and I create a button disabled value and set it to true. Back to the web page, and refresh, and you can see the button's now disabled. And the nice thing is that just like everything else in Angular, this binding is dynamic. So if I were to change the value from true to false, it would immediately enable the button. The next directive we'll look at is the form directive. The reason we have a form directive is that the HTML spec does not allow forms to be nested. But if you want to section a form off into smaller sections, say for example while doing validation, then the ng form directive can be nested inside of other forms and allow you to create smaller sections of forms. The submit directive is a lot like the event directives that we saw earlier, only it allows you to call a method on your scope if the form is submitted, regardless of how that happens. Whether or not you click a submit button or hit the enter key, as long as the form is submitted, instead of submitting the form, it'll call your function. The next two directives are somewhat similar to each other. Those are the href and source directives. The href directive is for binding the href attribute on an anchor tag, and the source directive is for binding the source attribute on an image. As we discussed before, if you set the source attribute of an image to a binding, the browser will immediately try to request that binding as the URL and fail. So the source directive allows you to give Angular a chance to run its bindings before the browser requests the image. Href is a little similar in that if you have a binding to an href on an anchor tag, and you're worried that that anchor tag might get clicked programmatically or manually before Angular has a chance to run, then the href directive will assure that that doesn't happen because the anchor tag won't actually have an href attribute until Angular runs and replaces that directive with an actual href attribute. The next directive is the non-bindable directive. This one is unique in that it specifies an area that may look like an Angular directive, but you're telling Angular specifically do not parse and do the binding that happens inside of this directive. This is easiest to illustrate with an example. Let's go into our HTML and let's add a div. Now, as we'll discuss in a moment, this is the expression syntax with Angular. So if we run this in the browser, what we see is the result of that 1 plus 2, which is 3. But let's assume that we actually wanted the text 2 curly braces and 1 plus a 2 to show up in our browser. We simply add the ng non-bindable directive, rerun, and we see the actual text instead, and Angular won't parse what's inside of that element. And so with that, we've looked at the majority of the basic directives that are available in Angular. Let's finish up with a quiz. What does the ng form directive allow you to do? The ng form directive allows you to nest forms within each other. Which directive delays fetching an image until after the binding has occurred? That is the ng source directive. And why do we need the ng disabled directive? Because of ambiguities in the HTML spec. For example, setting disabled equals false doesn't actually disable the control in many browsers.